Why is the America First investment policy necessary?
We've had a 25-year period here where all manner of Chinese companies were coming into the U.S. capital markets with no real diligence performed, no oversight, no screening. The fact that many of these companies were sanctioned by the United States for egregious national security and human rights violation didn't seem to be a problem. And we had some 5,000 Chinese companies take this route who are today traded on U.S. exchanges. That's a rough number. And there's probably 75 plus million of us who are holding those companies, or some of them certainly, in our investment portfolios and retirement accounts. So this has become a major source of funding for the Chinese Communist Party and the People's Liberation Army, to the tune of trillions of dollars, not hundreds of billions, over this period. And it was high time, vastly past time, that something be done about this. And fortunately, the president has stepped up to this and done something terribly important, historically important, in the America First investment policy.
Does the policy balance investment growth with national security?
I think that the right balance has been struck here between our welcoming foreign investment of all kinds for American jobs and prosperity. That's perfectly appropriate. We're free market people for the most part, and but we're looking for fair trade, not just trade for its own sake, as we're finding. And we're also big on reciprocity, which the president's properly emphasizing right now. So that said, we want to be a home to the world in terms of investment. However, the president points out that not all investment is in American interests. Sometimes, of course, the Chinese are coming into the United States to buy or otherwise take a stake in American companies that have high technology and other applications that they're very interested in acquiring. And that's a big problem for us because it involves intellectual property theft, technology theft, and other concerns. But the bigger problem, in my opinion, has been completely overlooked until now, for the most part anyway, which is the outbound investment. That is, these scores of millions of Americans who are making investments in those thousands of Chinese companies that have not been properly screened, that are oftentimes bad actor companies sanctioned by this country. And that has been the source of tremendous revenue flows and other funding for the People's Republic of China that was completely antithetical to our national interest. And so he's tried to walk that line, and I think he has done so successfully.
There's a big disconnect in Washington between policy and implementation. How can this policy be effective?
Well, it's certainly the right problem to make note of. I mean, there's the devil's in the details here, and there's a lot of room between the proverbial lip and the cup when it comes to the president's announced intentions and indeed demands, as he's offered these instructions to the executive branch, so-called interagency community, or the interagency process, as we call it. Everybody's on notice now as to what his intentions are. And the question then becomes, are these agencies of government, particularly the ones that have been very reluctant to go down this path in the past, such as the Treasury Department, the Securities and Exchange Commission, the National Economic Council, often led by high-level Wall Street executives who will go through the revolving door, so to speak, and come into government and then go out and take their previous posts. And I'm afraid that that has created a conflicted environment in many cases. That's not to say all of the folks in those agencies, but this has been a consistent problem that I hope very much that we won't see in the Trump administration. And I'm encouraged that for a change, we won't have this same problem. But it does mean vigilance. it does mean holding feet to the fire and accountability in the details, because this is all lives or dies, if you will, in the fine print. And we've been taken to the cleaners in the fine print more times than I can count. So the idea of dilution, evisceration of these intentions of the president is always a distinct possibility, whether it's President Trump or another of his predecessors. And this is something we have to urgently stay on top of. And same was true with Capitol Hill and the think tank community and all of those of us who care deeply about seeing the integrity of the president's policy properly observed.
Do states have a role in implementing this policy?
Well, I think they better darn well. I mean, the president made plain that the public employee retirement systems or the pension funds of the 50 states are implicated here, as are state-sponsored university endowments. These are just two sources that the Chinese have successfully tapped into for hundreds of billions of dollars over time. And so it's incumbent on the states, governors, lieutenant governors, treasurers, attorney generals, to get serious about the fact that holding a number of these types of Chinese companies, a large number, regrettably, is absolutely contrary to the national interest and inconsistent with the president's now America First investment policy. They need to get on board. The simplest way, obviously, would go ex-China, ex-Hong Kong, which is market speak for avoiding Chinese companies altogether. But if you're going to hold Chinese companies, which we have to understand are all controlled by the Chinese Communist Party at the end of the day, let's do so with as benign companies as we can, who aren't part of the PLA supply chain, who are not part of the espionage and other nefarious activities that the Chinese government has pressed them into service. After all companies in China, under Article 7 of the National Intelligence Law and many others, are beholden to observe the demands of the Chinese Communist Party when it comes to their strategic role. And that means very bad news for us. So I think it's time for the states to get the wake-up call here and follow suit. And I would say that I hope to see a major divestment of Chinese holdings, and indeed the bulk of those holdings, because again, you need to prove that these companies that you are continuing to hold in portfolio are not corporate bad actors. No easy task.
Can you discuss legislation to protect public markets and tools for predicting global financial risks?
Well, fortunately, there are a number of pieces of bipartisan legislation that we've been able to backstop from the point of view of data and analytics via the Kroc Institute and elsewhere, whereby the Capitol Hill is getting a very much a crash course on what constitutes a Chinese bad actor, what kinds of avenues are they using to exploit the U.S. capital markets. For example, it gets into kind of exotic sounding names like A-shares, which are Chinese companies that are only listed on Chinese domestic exchanges, and yet index providers in the United States, MSCI, FTSE Russell, Dow S&P, scoop up these companies, put them on a list of emerging market companies, and then the asset managers turn those lists into investment products that are in turn primarily exchange-traded funds that are farmed out to scores of millions of unwitting Americans. And that's how we come to hold all of these Chinese bad actors. So we have to be doing away with A-shares. There's no oversight. There's no regulatory scrutiny. There's no consistency with U.S. securities laws. There's nothing to say that they can't be sanctioned. It's all legal today. It needs to be illegal. And there's a list of other actions. Look at blacklisted Chinese companies who are on various sanctions lists. Should they be allowed to be raising money from the American people when at the same time you can't sell them, in many cases, equipment and technology, but you can keep them in business? How is that possibly consistent? So if you're on a blacklist of the United States, doesn't matter which one, you need to be out of the capital markets, out of our private equity funds right away, and it needs to be illegal for American persons worldwide to be holding the stocks and bonds of those companies and their subsidiaries, who oftentimes go to our markets for the same purpose in order to feed their parent company, so to speak. So those are among just two of a number of angles here that have to be covered if we're really going to do the job properly.
Are there key pieces of legislation we should be watching closely?
Well, yes. I mean, Victoria Spartz and Brad Sherman, a Democrat from California, Victoria, I believe, is a Republican from Indiana, bipartisan legislation. And they've introduced a number of pieces of legislation, one of which deals directly with this blacklisting. I mean, they're talking about consolidating the list of any blacklisted companies, which should properly be the case. You have an OFAC list, you have a Pentagon list, you have a Commerce Department entity list, you have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act list. All of these lists need to be consolidated. Those companies can no longer have the privilege of trading on our exchanges, raising funds from the American people, and being held by Americans around the world in their investment portfolios. All of that needs to stop, and it needs to stop legally. That is to be made illegal. Why? Because Wall Street firms have sadly been very clear about one point. If it's legal, we're doing it. Never mind their corporate reputations and brands. Never mind the fact that these companies are responsible for trafficking in slave labor, equipping concentration camps, aiding and abetting genocide in Xinjiang, building hypersonic glide vehicles for the People's Liberation Army, the last two aircraft carriers, new generations of ICBMs targeting American families. Is that what we had in mind with our hard-earned retirement dollars of the American people? I don't think so. They would be as mad as hell, frankly, if they knew where their money's going and how it's being used by these Wall Street folks who have engaged in callous, reckless investment practices.